Good evening. I'm Pat Callahan. Welcome to our News Center Voice of the Voter Forum with the candidates for U.S. Senate. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, so let's meet the candidates. The Democrat is Zak Ringelstein of Yarmouth. He's a former teacher and CEO of an education business designed to help teachers and students collaborate. Angus King of Brunswick is the independent candidate. He was governor of Maine for 8 years and is seeking his second term in the U.S. Senate. And Eric Brakey of Auburn is the Republican nominee. He has served 2 terms in the Maine Senate. Gentlemen, I welcome you all. Tonight I'm going to be asking questions. We'll also have some questions submitted by viewers via social media with the hashtag ME Senate Debate. Now, we don't have a strict time limit on answers, but we do ask that candidates try to be as succinct as you can so we can cover as much ground as possible, and I'll step in to try to keep the discussion moving when necessary. And each candidate will have 1 minute for a closing statement. So let's get started. Zak Ringelstein, I know one of the big parts of your campaign is pushing for Medicare for all.
Yes, sir.
It's unlikely that's going to happen anytime soon, especially if Republicans control the Senate. So on the way to that goal, if that's your ultimate goal, what are a couple of steps that can be taken realistically to improve the availability and the cost of health care in this country?
So first and foremost, health care is a human right. I am the only person on this stage who is rejecting pharmaceutical money. And I had a student a few years ago who literally died in my classroom. She was an 11-year-old and she was misdiagnosed. Her parents didn't know how to navigate the healthcare system, and because of that, she died. This is the America that we live in. Someone needs to fight for universal access to basic healthcare right now. We need Medicare for all.
So what step do you push for first?
The first step is I want to be the 17th U.S. Senator. Again, Senator Angus King takes money from pharmaceutical companies and won't stand for Medicare for all when our neighbors and our children are dying because of this. That's not okay in the richest country on earth. We pay the most per capita on healthcare in any country.
What does 17th Senator mean? I'm not following you.
Yeah, so 70% of Americans support Medicare for all, and over 50% of Republicans support Medicare for all. But because of the way that money buys off our U.S. senators, only 16 U.S. senators will support Medicare for all. So I want to be the 17th U.S. senator to support Medicare for all and fight for it every single day when I'm in the U.S. Senate.
This is important enough that I want to get everybody in on this. What are the steps you think can be achieved realistically in the U.S. Senate over the next couple of years?
First, I think it's important to underline that I think health care is a human right. If you don't have health care, nothing else really matters. So I do think it's a human right. I think as a practical matter, the place to start is with the Affordable Care Act, which across the country reduced the uninsured rate in half when you add it to private insurance, Medicare, and Medicaid. So I think that's where we begin. My only problem with Medicare for all is this is a huge, complicated system, and a lot of people have the insurance that they like through their employer. And if you suddenly tell them, no, you can't have that anymore, we're going to have a government-run system for everyone, all of a sudden, I don't think that's going to work very well. The other piece is Medicare survives financially in part by reimbursing hospitals and doctors at a lower rate than private insurance. If we had Medicare for all in Maine tomorrow, half the hospitals would close within a week because they wouldn't be having adequate support for what they do. So I think the goal is universal health care. I think the only difference between Zak and I is how we get there.
Eric Brakey, what are the first steps you want to take?
Well, first of all, let me say taxing poor people for being too afford health insurance is not a way to fix our health care crisis. You know, Angus, when you were governor of the state, you opposed the individual mandate. You said it was a bad idea. I actually think you were right back then. Now you've flip-flopped on it, and you have voted against repealing the individual mandate on people. Of course, insurance. Of course, the level of uninsured is going to go down when you are forcing people to buy a product that they may or may not necessarily want. But also, many Maine people have paid millions of dollars in fines to the federal government because this isn't a solution that works for them. We do need to fix our healthcare system. It is broken. It was broken before Obamacare. It's broken after Obamacare.
So what's your first step?
We need to put patients back in charge of our own healthcare again. Our healthcare system is dominated by third parties standing in our way, big insurance companies and big government bureaucrats standing between us and our doctors. We need to put power back in the hands of regular people. We can do that by giving choice and competition, things like empowering people to be able to save tax-free through health savings accounts, allowing people to buy insurance across state lines to increase choice and competition, allowing people to collectively bargain together to increase leverage with insurance companies through health associations. These are market-driven solutions we can look at that will actually work to make healthcare more affordable. Giving government full control over our healthcare system isn't going to work. Government can't run the post office, and the healthcare systems we have in place, including government healthcare for our veterans aren't even treated very well. Do we think that we're going to be treated better than our veterans in government-run healthcare?
Senator King, let me ask you this. Given the fury and the bitterness of the fight over Justice Kavanaugh, what evidence is there, if any, that having an independent in the Senate has made any kind of difference?
Well, you pick probably the most partisan issue that I've seen in my 6 years in the Senate. There are lots of issues where I've been able to work with both sides, starting with the student loan crisis in 2013 when the rates were just about to double. A small group of us, Republicans, Democrats, and myself, put together a compromise that solved that problem. They tell me it saved $50 billion for students across the country, a couple of $100 million in Maine in interest rates. All kinds of examples. Probably the most recent one that's coming to fruition tomorrow, I'm going to be in Norwich Walk celebrating a contract from the Defense Department to New Balance shoe for 200,000 pairs of athletic shoes that resulted from an amendment that I and Bruce Poliquin and Susan Collins worked on, but I got it through the through the Armed Services Committee over John McCain's vociferous objections by garnering 4 or 5 Republican votes, making it a bipartisan vote. We got it into the bill, and tomorrow we're celebrating the contract. That was a bipartisan action that is exactly what we have to do. We're working with national parks. There are many, many areas where working together is how we get things done. Unfortunately, Pat, conflict, you mentioned Kavanaugh, is where all the attention comes. But the very week of the big Kavanaugh vote and the fight, the Senate passed a major opioid bill, 99-1. Totally bipartisan. We'd worked on it for a year. I think it's going to make a real difference. So that's the way we've got to go if we're going to get anything done.
I'd like to respond to that. Senator, the fact is you've run as an independent, you tell us you're an independent, but you vote 92% of the time with Chuck Schumer. You have voted against tax cuts for the middle class. You've voted against every single Supreme Court nomination. You voted against repealing Obamacare.
Well, what
every
about
single,
this?
I've
heard you say this a number of times. He votes 92% with Chuck Schumer, yet on the website 538, it gives you a score of something like 44% voting on the Trump agenda, voting for it.
Well, here's I was going to say, he thinks I vote for Trump with Trump too much.
That only makes sense if you're counting the naming of post offices as the same as whether or not you have tax cuts for the middle class. So personally, I think that tax cuts for the middle class.
To the bill that we passed last year, that wasn't a tax cut for the middle class.
Can I add to this conversation? Yeah, this is not a normal president. And the fact that Senator Angus King works with Trump 47% of the time, votes with Trump 47% of the time, is a complete and utter disgrace.
I think these two guys ought to go offshore and figure out which one it is.
Senator Brakey, I want to ask you, you describe yourself as someone who would be the true independent, someone who has been able to work across the aisle in the Maine legislature. But on social media, you have some pretty harsh words for your opponent. Here's a tweet that you posted in July. Angus King and Chuck Schumer weren't happy when Trump went to negotiate peace with North Korea, nor with Russia, a nuclear superpower. It seems the only thing that will make Angus, Chuck, and Nancy Pelosi happy is if a nuclear bomb is dropped on the United States, because that will mean President Trump has failed. First, do you honestly believe this is true? Do you think this is the civil discourse that Maine voters want?
I stand by it, but obviously there's a little hyperbole there. I don't mean that he literally wants us to be nuked. What I mean is that the partisan games that are taking place in Washington, D.C., while President Trump is negotiating with nuclear powers like North Korea, like Russia, and so many like Angus and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi are rushing to try to score partisan points, to try to hope that he would fail. I mean, that's what we saw taking place.
If you demonize someone with whom you disagree, why would anybody in the Senate say, I want to work with that guy?
The point I'm making is that these issues, especially our national security, are so important that we should not be playing partisan games with them. For so long, the number one responsibility of the President of the United States was to keep us out of a hot war with Russia. John F. Kennedy spoke with Russia during the height of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan spoke with Russia during the height of the Cold War.
And is this the way to get that message across?
I think the Maine people deserve to know that the partisan games that are being played in Washington, D.C. with our national security, I think it's that important.
Pat, 2 of the committees I'm on are Armed Services and Intelligence. I can tell you they're the most nonpartisan committees in the whole Senate. and we work on these foreign issues on a nonpartisan basis. I don't think I've been critical of President Trump trying to open a diplomatic discussion with North Korea. I'm all for it. I'd much rather have that than the kind of friction we were leading toward. My only concern is that he's gotten so invested in this, he's forgetting that we've been here 5 times before, and each time we make concessions and the Koreans pull back. So I just hope when that happens, or if it happens, I hope it doesn't happen, but if it happens, that we not overreact and create a situation that's really dangerous.
And I think we need to
we
need to respect our senator here. I mean, he is a good guy and he served our state well. Senator King, I thank you for your service. I think it is time for the future, and I do think it is really disgusting, Eric, that you have created, you've decided to go by the way of the Trump agenda with violent rhetoric. And violent rhetoric leads to violent action. It's despicable. You really should be ashamed of yourself. I actually think it's time for you to withdraw from this race and to really take a look in the mirror as to what you're doing.
You're the one polling in single digits. Maybe it's time for you to withdraw from this race. Here's the actual truth. The actual truth is that as governor, Angus grew state spending 45%. He left us $1 billion in debt. We've been trying to dig out of that hole for the last 16 years. In the meanwhile, our kids have been moving away in search of job opportunities in other states. Now, over the last several years, we've cut spending. I've helped, as the Senate Chairman for Health and Human Services, I've reformed welfare. We're finally getting more jobs in our state, but we're still digging out of that hole. It's time for a better deal for Maine. We've been getting a rotten deal for Maine, and it's time for a better one. Better jobs, better health care, and let's just get Washington, D.C. out of our lives.
All right, we're going to take a break. Be back with more of our New Center Voice of the Voter Forum with the candidates for U.S. Senate after this.
They're both in remission, have the same pre-existing condition. But if Sean Moody becomes governor, they might not get the same care. Moody opposed expanding health care, denying nearly 90,000 Mainers access to critical care. And Moody opposes the law stopping insurance companies from denying coverage for pre-existing conditions. They should worry about fighting cancer, not fighting for coverage. Sean Moody's not fighting for Maine. The top funder of A Better Maine is the Democratic Governors Association.
I'm Bruce Poliquin, and I approve this message.
More false ads? The truth? Bruce Poliquin supports health care for pre-existing conditions, but Radical Golden will let government control your health care, ending Medicare as we know it, doubling taxes. Golden's opioid solution, providing free taxpayer-funded needles for drug users. And Golden backs a radical group who will stop Mainers from purchasing home heating oil, natural gas, or even gasoline. Jared Golden's too radical for Maine.
The critical facts on Bruce Poliquin and healthcare. For Congressman Poliquin, nearly $400,000 from insurance interests. For Maine, voted to gut protections for pre-existing medical conditions. For Poliquin, insurance money. For Maine, voted to charge older Mainers up to 5 times more than younger Mainers for care. AARP calls it an age tax. It's time to make a change and do what's right for Maine, not Bruce Poliquin and the special interests. Patriot Majority USA is responsible for the content of this advertising.
I've spent 10 years providing home care for seniors here in Maine. I've carefully reviewed Question 1, and it's a bad idea. It distributes a patient's private information without their consent. And Question 1 raises taxes on middle-class families, while giving benefits to millionaires and out-of-state residents. Maine seniors deserve quality home care, but Question 1 is a bad and costly idea. Please join leading medical associations in voting no on Question 1.
Welcome back to our New Center Voice of the Voter Forum. Tonight we are talking with the 3 candidates for U.S. Senate. 11 people were shot to death at a synagogue in Pittsburgh this past weekend. President Trump suggested, well, they should have had an armed guard at that service. Is that the best we can do, Zak Ringelstein, is to have armed guards at church services?
No, definitely not.
So what do we do instead?
This is. I just want to speak to this for one moment because this is such a scary thing to have happen. There was a Holocaust survivor who was literally shot and killed by an AR-15 in her place of worship in a synagogue. How terrible that this is happening in the United States of America in 2018. We owe it to our kids, to future generations, to our country to start anew and start trying to actually curb what is going on with hatred in this country, and I think it is despicable that this new white supremacy, white nationalist rhetoric is even getting any attention. We need to start projecting hope, and I hope that on November 6th we can truly start again with real leadership who represents people.
Does it call for any kind of new gun legislation, any restrictions?
Yes, absolutely.
Such as?
Yeah, so I have been very clear about this. I support the Second Amendment, and yet I am somebody who believes that we should not have military-style weapons out there. We need to have sensible conversations. The NRA is funding some people's campaigns, and unfortunately what that does is distorts the conversation. It makes it so that we can't have rational dialogue at the table. We can't do sensible things like create universal background checks. I had a note today actually from a former mayor in this state who said, "I'm voting for you, I endorse you. The reason I endorse you is because you're the only person who's standing up for this." And Senator Angus King actually voted to repeal Obama-era background checks for those who are severely mentally ill, and that's really disappointing. It's the example that we need to use for how people need to really stand up in this time.
Senator King, I feel like we've had this discussion many times over the last 6 years since you've been in office. What about this idea that, and I've heard this from other people, about voting to repeal restrictions on people who are mentally ill from having weapons?
There was a provision that if you were found under the Social Security Administration not able to handle your finances, that would put you on the no-buy list. I oppose that because, number one, there was no due process. Remember, we're talking about a constitutional right here. And number two, having difficulty handling finances doesn't necessarily mean you can't go deer hunting. And not only did I oppose it, 23 disability rights groups opposed it, the ACLU opposed it, and it was just not the right rule. Now, I supported the major Manchin-Toomey universal background check bill in 2013. We didn't quite make it to 60 votes. I've always been in favor of universal background checks, no fly, no buy, banning bump stocks, limiting magazine size, similar to what is true in Maine when you go hunting. You can't have more than a bullet in the chamber and 5 in the magazine. So those are the kind of limitations that I've talked about that I think we can achieve. I think one part about this discussion, Pat, is what can we actually do? What can we get through? What can we accomplish that will change this picture? One other thing I want to mention. Obviously, this guy in Pittsburgh is mentally unstable. I had dinner about a month ago with Bill Cassidy, a Republican senator from Louisiana who's a physician. We were talking about this and we realized that the amount of money that the government invests in research in physical diseases is 30 times the amount in mental diseases. I think that's something we have to change. We're having an epidemic of gun violence, of depression, of suicide, of PTSD. We need to do more in the area of mental health, plus reasonable limitations, background checks, and those kinds of things.
Eric
but I
Brakey
don't think putting guns in every church and synagogue is the answer.
Is that the answer? Armed guards in churches and synagogues?
Angus, you just said something completely philosophically inconsistent. You said you opposed that for our seniors because there was no due process, and then you say you support no fly, no buy, which the no fly list has no due process either. There are 6-year-olds. There are 6-year-olds on the no fly list. Actually, the ACLU publicly came out against using that as a standard because there is no due process. People don't know how they're on that list, and they can't get off that list when they're on it. I'm the only pro-Second Amendment candidate in this race. I'm proud of the fact that I have an A+ with the NRA, an A+ with the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, and an A+ with Gun Owners of Maine. Angus, you have a D with the NRA, a D with Gun Owners of Maine, and a B with the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, and they specifically didn't endorse you because of your support for gun control.
They didn't endorse you either,
but I got an A+. And I'm proud of that fact. And
as you've taken money from the NRA.
Well, I don't think I've gotten a check from this go around, but if they wanted to send me one, I'd be glad to take it. You know, here's the thing. So I'm proud of the fact I sponsored Maine's constitutional carry law. I worked with Republicans and Democrats to get that passed. You know, our Second Amendment rights are fundamental to a free society. And heaven forbid, if someone were to march into this studio right now with the intent to harm us in here, what's the one thing we would all be hoping and praying for? We'd be hoping and praying that someone in this room was armed and trained and ready to respond in such a crisis. Otherwise, we'd all be in a lot of trouble.
Research does not prove this, okay? This is a ridiculous argument. argument.
Zach,
You're more likely
92%
to
of
get killed or kill somebody else if you were armed.
Zach,
and that is just the reality.
92% of all mass shootings that take place in this country take place in gun-free zones. This is
if you had a guard at the synagogue with a handgun and a guy with an AR-15 comes in, I don't know. Is that enough? Is that sufficient?
Well,
we don't know.
It gives you a fighting chance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I know when I go to church, many of the churches here in Maine, they have people carrying, people allowed to carry, and people providing security. I mean,
Do we really want to be a society where people have guns in churches and schools?
The thing
This
is,
is classic Eric
going to fix
Brakey.
this problem.
Fear mongering at the expense of real freedom.
Government
and that is what you're doing, sir.
Criminals
it is really
don't obey
horrible.
the gun
No
laws.
one's trying to take away.
Last word on this from Senator Brakey.
Criminals don't obey gun laws. You can pass whatever law you want. Criminals don't follow it. We might as well make the state of Maine a murder-free zone. In fact, I think we already have. But people are still committing crimes. They don't follow the laws. Law-abiding citizens do. You're disarming law-abiding citizens with these laws. And you know what? Here in Maine, we have the strongest Second Amendment protections in the entire country. We're also ranked the safest state in America. In fact, 4 out of the top 5 safest states in America are all constitutional carry states because we have the right to defend ourselves.
We're going to start the next round with Senator King. Is climate change caused in part by human activity? If so, what are 2 things you think can realistically be done about that?
The answer is, of course, human activity. You can look at all the data of the emission of CO2 into the atmosphere starting with the Industrial Revolution, and it just goes like this. We're at the highest level of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in 3 million years. So absolutely, that's the cause. There's no doubt about it. I don't think there's any serious argument on that front. The question is, what do we do? The first thing we do is to move forward with initiatives like the Clean Power Plan, which the Obama administration put forward, which I thought was a creative way to approach it because it wasn't a heavy-handed Washington saying, this is what you have to do. It said, these are the goals, the states figure out how to achieve those goals. We also we shouldn't be doing things like leaving the Climate Accord in Paris, which was a non-mandatory treaty. It was an aspirational treaty, but it made the point that this is a worldwide problem. We could do everything in the world here in Maine, and I know this from having worked with clean air when I was governor. We could shut down all the cars and all the factories in Maine. We'd still have an air pollution problem because of the prevailing winds coming from the west. So this is a worldwide problem. Pollution doesn't respect boundaries. So those are a couple of things we can do, and then of course moving toward a fossil fuel free future. But it's going to take time to get there. I've worked a good part of my adult life in alternative energy, in things like hydroelectric power and wind power and conservation and biomass. All those things can work, but we need transition to get there. That's going to involve natural gas, which is twice as clean burning as oil and coal. And that the big missing piece, Pat, that I think we're going to crack in the next 5 years is storage. Once we can store electricity, then we'll be able to go to a fossil-free future.
Senator Brakey, are there steps you want to take to curb climate change?
We all want to protect our environment. I think certainly we all want to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere, absolutely. And the question is, how do we do that? I'll tell you what doesn't do anything to get us there. The Climate Change Accord didn't do anything. What has made a big difference is actually that we've been switching over to bridge fuels like natural gas instead of oil. But another thing that has done absolutely nothing to help our environment is blowing off the tops of our mountains in order to get expensive energy and driving up the bills of Maine people. But it's certainly worked out well for certain special interests. Angus, when you were governor of the state of Maine, you wrote the energy laws forcing us to subsidize companies that blow off the tops of our mountains, drive up our energy bills, and then you went to work for those companies.
Are you talking about wind power?
Absolutely. Wind power, the wind doesn't blow when we want it to blow. It's very expensive. It makes absolutely no sense. You made a lot of money off of this. You're ranked the richest politician in Maine now.
I think the law that you're talking about was passed 5 years after I left office. I was a pretty good governor, but I didn't have remote control 5 years into the future. Passed in 2008.
The renewable energy portfolio requiring us to do 30% towards renewable energy. That was under your tenure as governor. I can pull the bill for you if you'd like to see it.
I don't complain about that.
Let's talk about the future here. Zak Ringelstein, what are 2 steps you think are achievable in a Republican-led Senate?
So I believe that we need to treat this like a crisis. By 2040, it will be too late. Coral reefs will be gone. Our children's world will be ravaged by droughts and floods and starvation. And we're going to have hundreds of millions of people who are migrating across the world trying to find new places to live. This is not the world I want to raise my kids into, quite frankly. And I don't think anyone on this stage is treating this like it's a crisis. We need to unify Republicans and Democrats for our kids' future by creating what I call a Green New Deal, which is converting to 100% renewable energy by 2035, which would then, by the way, create high-wage jobs using humane technologies right here in the state of Maine. We need to do this. We don't have time. And quite frankly, Angus, you take money from ExxonMobil. I don't get why you would do that. I want to ask you why you introduced legislation last year to fast-track pipelines through our state, bypassing community and tribal rights. I don't get how you claim to be a climate activist. Listen, I like you, but again, I don't understand how you're not leading on this issue. My kids will not have a safe and healthy world.
Let's give him a chance to answer.
And wait, last question
One
is,
thing that Zach and I agree on is that Angus is bought and paid for by the energy lobby. A full third of all his campaign contributions come from energy lobbyists.
What?
We've gone through your finance reports. We've gone through them. A full third come from people connected to the energy lobby. I'd be happy to provide that after this.
That's nonsense. That's the first I've heard of it. Let's talk about this bill.
You have other Democrat fundraisers doing the fundraising for you.
When I was governor, I used to say I want Maine to have the most stringent environmental laws in the country and the most efficient and timely and predictable process to get the permits. I think you can do both of those things, and in fact we did. The pipeline bill that Zach is talking about doesn't waive any environmental requirements. It doesn't cut any corners. It simply says there's going to be a lead agency, there's going to be a time frame that's predictable, and the reason I supported that is we have a very heavy dependence in New England and in Maine on natural gas. Natural gas, unfortunately, in New England is about twice as expensive as anywhere else in the country, not because of the gas, but because of a lack of pipeline capacity into Massachusetts to get the gas to us. We lost a paper mill in Bucksport in part because of a huge increase in natural gas in the winter. We had a huge one this winter. It's costing our consumers money. I'm thinking about the people that are paying their heating costs throughout Maine. So I've been on this issue from the very beginning, and I don't understand, frankly, why this is a partisan issue. It's become one for reasons that I don't understand, and I don't know what these guys are talking about all this energy money. If the energy, I voted against the Keystone Pipeline. I voted to retain the automobile standards. I oppose the leaving of the climate change. If the energy people think they're going to buy my vote, which they're not. They're making an awfully poor investment.
All right, we're going to move on from this. There's another looming problem that a lot of people think is very serious, and that is the national debt. Democrats claim the Trump tax cuts are largely to blame for the recent increase in the debt. Republicans claim it's growing entitlements, such as Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Are you concerned about the national debt, and if so, what do we do about it?
Absolutely, I am. We're $21 trillion in debt. We have $113 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That's a bill of $1.1 million for every single American taxpayer. As a young American, I'm very concerned about it. It's my generation that's going to be paying this off for the rest of our lives. And here's how we got here. We have Republicans who always want to spend more on overseas spending. Democrats who always want to spend more on welfare spending. And then we have Angus King who comes and says, well, let's just spend more on everything and then we'll all be happy. But we get stuck with the bill. Angus, you've been ranked one of the biggest spenders in Washington, D.C. by nonpartisan groups. There's not a single spending bill you've ever voted against. And that bill is racking up on my generation. People may blame the tax cuts, but here's the truth. Government took in more money this past year than any other year on record. So it's not a revenue problem. It's a spending problem. If we're going to get this under the control, the first place we have to cut, let's look at some of the overseas spending. We've been in Afghanistan now for 17 years.
So you don't want to cut entitlements such as Social Security or Medicare?
I think that's the last place you look to cut. The first place we should look at the overseas spending. Bring the money home. I'm sick and tired of bombing and rebuilding bridges in other countries. It's time to bring that money home, invest in shoring up our promises to our seniors here, and investing in infrastructure here at home.
Mr. Ringelstein, what do you think?
Debt is a huge problem, but it's because the economy is rigged for the ultra wealthy and because our U.S. Senate is bought and paid for by special interests. I'm the only person in this race who's not taking corporate PAC, lobbyists, or fossil fuel money. And the reality is that tax bill that passed is $1.9 trillion that goes directly to the top 1%. Doesn't help out working class people. It increases our debt, and sadly, with this Republican control, whether it was under Bush or whether it was under Trump, they are who is adding to our debt. And we can't have this. We need to start actually investing in people, in the working class, in the people who are making a buck by doing the hard work. And it's only then when we invest in us, the productive workers in our economy, when we're going to actually start dealing with this crisis.
Senator King?
I agree with both of these guys in a sense. First, that the debt is a real serious problem. There's no question about it, and it's one that is burdening the future. I said the other day we're the first generation to inherit from our parents and borrow from our kids, and that's why I voted against the tax cut. It was unfunded. A tax cut that requires you to borrow money to fill the hole that the taxes would have filled isn't a tax cut. It's just shifting the tax to your kids. And it was like, I think it's $1.5 trillion. I've heard recently it now looks more like $1.9 trillion. And that's additional to the debt that was totally unnecessary because the economy was in good shape and was moving forward. And now we're seeing a growth of inflation, which is going to be a problem.
Here are the facts.
So,
hang on one sec.
So I think it's clear that the debt is a problem. And I think we need to look at particularly the spending. Foreign spending, I think, is a good place to start. And things like our wars in other places, our commitment of troops, those are worthwhile in examining. On the other hand, we can't just pull back from the world. Whether we like it or not, we're the leaders, and if we try to just pull back to within our borders, that's just not going to work, and we'll end up in worse situations worldwide.
Last word on this.
All right. Here are the facts. Angus, as you ran as a fiscal conservative for governor, you grew state spending 45%. You left us $1 billion in debt. In fact, here's an article on that right here. You left us $1 billion in debt. In the U.S. Senate, you have personally voted to rack up $5 trillion in debt on the American people. This is grossly irresponsible. You can talk a good game about fiscal responsibility, but the only time I've ever heard you shed crocodile tears about the debt is when it's about letting people keep more of the money that we earn. You've been ranked the biggest spender in Washington, D.C. You're spending trillions we don't have.
Who ranked me that?
Nonpartisan spending groups.
Because
I'd be happy to pull it for you.
The Fix the Debt, a nonpartisan group, gave me a little statue for being a fiscal hero for paying attention to these issues. So I'm not really sure where that data comes from.
Can you name a single spending bill you have ever voted against? Because I've searched and I can't find one.
And I want to add that the only way we're going to deal with this is by making sure our U.S. Senate isn't bought by special interests. We need to start moving beyond these little squabbles into a real conversation about who will be the best U.S. Senator until 2025. And it's very clear that someone who is not influenced by big money is what we need right now.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to get to some of your questions submitted via social media. Our Voice of the Voter forum with the candidates for U.S. Senate continues after this.
You work hard, and your representative should work just as hard for you. Problem is, Bruce Poliquin, he's working for these guys. Poliquin voted for tax breaks to his wealthy donors that add $2 trillion in debt, and he wants to slash Medicare and Social Security. He gave away $42 billion to Big Pharma, who gave him over $50,000. Bruce Poliquin doesn't work for working families. DCCC is responsible for the content of this advertising.
As a small businesswoman, I know you can't be a pushover, but you'll never get far on your own either. I'm Shelley Pingree, and I believe in working for all Mainers. More and more, that means being a check on the president. It means standing up for Maine farms and lobstermen hurt by the president's corporate agenda. It means fighting to keep coverage for pre-existing conditions. And it means protecting our coastline by fighting against climate change. That's why I approve this message, because I'll never stop fighting for Maine.
Maine's lobster industry doesn't just feed the world. It starts a food chain that feeds our entire economy. But as the planet and our waters warm, putting jobs at risk, Sean Moody denied humans impact climate change when asked, saying,
It's mostly, it's no.
If Sean Moody is willing to deny climate change and the impact it's having on our economy, he has no business being governor. The top funder of Maine Conservation Voters Action Fund is League of Conservation Voters.
I've spent 10 years providing home care for seniors here in Maine. I've carefully reviewed question 1, and it's a bad idea. It distributes a patient's private information without their consent. And question 1 raises taxes on middle-class families, while giving benefits to millionaires and out-of-state residents. Maine seniors deserve quality home care, but question 1 is a bad and costly idea. Please join leading medical associations in voting no on question 1.
We're back with the candidates for U.S. Senate and here in our Voice of the Voter Forum. And my colleague Lindsay Mills joins us now, and she's been getting some of the questions on social media with the hashtag ME Senate Debate. So let's find out what's on people's minds.
Absolutely. So first up, we have a question from Nelster. He asks about the crisis of elder care in Maine, specifically regarding thoughts of the candidates on question 1. Eric Brakey, how will you address the growing crisis of elder care in Maine?
Well, first of all, question 1 is a terrible question, very poorly worded, has a lot of problems. It would result in the biggest tax increase in Maine history, driving jobs and businesses away. Now, I will tell you, as the Senate chairman for the Health and Human Services Committee in Augusta, I've made services for our seniors one of my highest priorities. I think that if we're going to have a social safety net, we need to catch our most vulnerable people first, like our seniors at the end of their working careers, like those with adults with intellectual disabilities and autism. And frankly, it's a shame that we have spent so much money on welfare for non-citizens and able-bodied adults who can do more for themselves. So we need to shore up the long-term care continuum. I've supported that. I've fought for that. It's frustrating that so many politicians aren't able to make that a priority. And we're seeing that in Washington, D.C. as well. Social Security and Medicare are scheduled to be insolvent within the next 20 years, and no one's doing anything about it. You know, a lot of people say that they make our seniors a priority, but when they vote to spend money on everything, you're really prioritizing nothing. And that's what Angus King has done these last few years, spend money on everything and not prioritize our seniors.
This is about question 1 on the state ballot. Is there an alternative? Is there something you could do in the Senate that will address this issue?
Well, from the state Senate level, I have fought to shore up our long-term care continuum, home-based care for our seniors, assisted living and nursing home care. I will tell you, as I've toured the state and talked with directors of nursing homes, including small family business nursing homes, one of the things that they tell me that would be the biggest help is to cut some of these Washington, D.C. regulations that are dropped in their laps every 2 months. It seems they tell me that every 2 months new regulations are piled on. They're just getting used to the regulations from 2 months before. You have a situation where you have 7 nurses working in the back rooms doing administration while you only have 2 on the floor working with patients. We need to get Washington, D.C. out of our healthcare. We need to get Washington, D.C. out of our education. We need to get Washington, D.C. to follow the Constitution and let us work on a lot of these issues on the state level, because Washington, D.C. just makes it worse.
Let's hear from Zak Ringelstein on this too.
Sure. So I believe I'm the only person on this stage who supports question 1. And the reason is that there are too many people in the state, seniors in the state, who just can't afford it. They can't afford elder care. And what we need to do is we need to start taxing the wealthy where it counts. And the truth of the matter is that the most vulnerable in society are the ones who America is not working for right now. We are working for the top 1%, and those of you who have, who are in the top 1%, who have are able to live their senior years in a nice and healthy way. But those in Maine who are not in that very upper echelon of society need supports. And that's the basis of our campaign, is the belief that every single person in America deserves an opportunity to at least have the basic standards of care.
Senator King, your thoughts on this?
I think the motivation behind question 1 is exactly right. I've listened and heard all across Maine the problems of people isolated in their homes, not having access to care, not having transportation. It's a very complicated issue. My problem is I think question 1 creates a new bureaucracy. It's unaccountable. It would impose a very large tax increase that I'm not sure in the end wouldn't do more harm to the Maine economy than the treatment would provide. So I think we need to be thinking about things like telemedicine, accountable care organizations that are invested in keeping people well instead of only being compensated when they treat you for some kind of illness, and connecting seniors to their communities. I was in Machias a couple of weeks ago, and they told me that there are people in their community in rural areas, the only person they see in a week is the Meals on Wheels driver. That's a really tough problem, and I think it's one that we have to address. So I think question 1 focuses on the right problem. I'm just not sure it's the right answer.
Lindsay, you want to?
Sure, we're going to move on to our next question. Rich writes in asking about immigration. He says, where is the leadership on fixing immigration? What's your solution? Zak Ringelstein, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I had a student who walked into my classroom a year and a half ago, just down the street, and he came in crying and said, Mr. Ringelstein, my family is afraid that we're going to be deported. And it was the first time in my career as a public school teacher I couldn't say it was going to be all right, because it's not all right with this administration. We are creating human rights violations at the border that we literally would have gone to war with other countries for. And it's not okay. There's no excuse for the fear-mongering. We all in the working class are struggling in this country because the system is rigged, and there's no reason to use immigrants as fear-mongers, as some people in this race have done, as the Trump administration has done. We need to end deportations. We need to remember that we are a nation of immigrants, and that at the end of the day, I don't know if there's anyone out there, unless you're indigenous, out there in the audience, anyone who's not a descendant of immigrants. And we know that immigrants bring prosperity, and that we can be the melting pot that we can be, and we're gonna make sure that we do that by ending deportations and making sure that everyone can live this American dream if they want to. We also have to remember that refugees who are coming to this country are not coming off of their cozy couches with their DVR. These are folks who are fleeing violence and war, and they're coming here because they want to live the American dream. These are the kids who I've taught in my communities. And it's about time we start having a much more productive conversation than using them as a scapegoat for the real problem, which is that we really need to make sure that we're raising people's wages in this country, because a lot of people are living in fear. And I'm really sad that we're not having that conversation, which is the real conversation we need to be having.
Senator King?
Immigration is an incredibly emotional and difficult issue. I think the important thing to remember is what the point that Zach made. Except for the African Americans who were brought here against their will, and the Native Americans, all of us are immigrants at one point or another. And so we need to keep that. That's part of what the mainspring of America is. I think it was like 6 out of 7 of the Nobel Prize winners from America this year were children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. And so we can't just arbitrarily cut that off out of fear or out of some concern that just doesn't make sense. On the other hand, it is complicated. We can't have open borders. We do have to have borders. We do have to have border security. But this is something that can be solved. In 2013, we got 68 votes in the Senate for a comprehensive immigration reform bill that, by the way, I supported, had a huge border security provision in it. Anybody who says there's anybody in the Senate who wants open borders, that's just not true. But on the other hand, we need a humane policy. A lot of it is timeliness.
You
people who
called
come
open
for
borders in the 1990s when you were governor. You called for open borders.
People who come to this country as asylum seekers, for example, we need more, to be perfectly honest, things like judges to make the decision so they don't have to wait years and get lost in our society. So it's complicated, but I think if we hold on to our fundamental values and realize that all of us were immigrants, except for those groups that I mentioned, and that we can come to a resolution of this that will empower the country, strengthen the country, and at the same time provide an expression of our fundamental values.
Let's hear from Senator Brakey.
Well, first of all, let me say I'm the only candidate in this race who supports secure borders. And let's get one thing straight. Certainly people who want to come here, they're not bad people. In fact, I can understand why they want to come here. America is a great country. We're a land of opportunity. But it's also true that our immigration system is not a poverty relief program. You know, certainly if I was in their shoes, I might want to come here too. But if we just open our borders and welcome everyone here, we are going to find that America is at capacity before we've made any dent at all in the global poverty problem. If we want to address global poverty, the solution is actually pretty simple. It's capitalism. The emergence of free trade across the world has led to the lowest global poverty rate we have ever seen in recorded human history. You know, we can be that shining city on a hill again. We can be an example to other nations and how to create the level of prosperity that we enjoy here in America. And we can have immigration here to America, provided it's done legally and done in a way that benefits America. But here's one thing. I'll tell you, as I talk to Maine people, some of the rhetoric around this issue is frankly gets disturbing. Maine people are sick and tired of being called racist just because we don't want to see our communities transform overnight. Maine people are sick and tired of being called racist simply because we don't want non-citizens on the welfare rolls in front of people who've paid into the system their entire lives.
We need to get to another question from
Hold
the
on,
viewer,
this is an important point.
It is indeed, so is this.
Brian writes in, talking about his own age in his early 30s. He talks about high taxes and low wages. He's wondering what the candidates will do to work towards, or what changes you would make to keep young Mainers here.
Senator King, if you go first on that.
Well, first, there's some fascinating data that just came out last week that people between 25 and 35, we had a net import of people. We had people moving to Maine, almost 7,000 new people last year. But the key is, as you mentioned, taxes and wages, but that's really about better jobs. It's about training, it's about education, it's about integrating businesses with the community college system so that we're doing the training that we need. It's about upgrading people's skills. That's how you make more money. And all the data indicates that if you have more training, if you have more education, you're going to make more money. The companies are going to be more profitable. So that's really where we have to go. And also, we have to control taxes. Eric has mentioned several times tonight, when I was governor, we reduced taxes by a net of about 15% when I was governor.
And you increased spending 45%.
We reduced taxes by about 15% when I was governor, and that helped create an economic plus up of something like 80,000 jobs in 8 years. So you got to work on both sides of the equation, but giving people the skills that they need in order to compete and to create better jobs, that's what it's all about. And it's also about investing in technology. I think the biggest technology gap we have in Maine right now is broadband in our rural areas. If we don't have that, the rural areas and the small towns are going to be almost out of business in terms of the economy and also in terms of people living there.
And does government have to pay for that, or is that a public-private thing?
I think government has to assist. It's exactly like electrification in the 30s, where rural areas weren't getting electrified because the power company said they're too far, there are too many poles. Exactly the same thing is being said today. Franklin D. Roosevelt created rural electrification. It worked. And I think it's got to be a government-private, it's got to be public and private partnership, and that's exactly what we're working on throughout Maine today.
More big spending from Angus King without any plan to pay for it. I certainly agree we do need rural broadband, and I'll tell you how we get it. You know, I support 2 points. One, I'm going to be releasing a plan later this week to create those better jobs so our kids can stay here. And that includes things like economic freedom zones, identifying some of the most impoverished areas in our state, like Washington County, Aroostook County, and places across America, where we're going to cut federal taxes to next to nothing. Let the people keep the money that they have there and invest in creating better jobs there, attracting investment into those areas as well. That includes broadband. But there's also going to be always that problem of the last mile. And that's where we can look at cutting some of the overseas spending. Let's cut money that we send over to countries that don't like us very much, countries that burn our flag. Let's stop subsidizing wealthy countries that can provide for their own national defense but depend on the American taxpayers. Let's bring that money home. Let's invest in infrastructure and creating better jobs here in places like Washington and Aroostook County and the rural parts of Maine that are underdeveloped. We can do this, and we can pay for it. Now, Angus always talks about all the new programs he wants to pay for, but he never says how he's going to pay for it. That's why he's been ranked the biggest spender in Washington, D.C. There's never a single spending bill he's voted against.
We need to hear from Zak Ringelstein on this before we run out of time.
So, first and foremost, I have met way too many young Mainers who are working 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. They are asking why they're paying so much in debt, why healthcare costs so much. Many of them don't even pay for their healthcare because they can't afford it. This is ridiculous in 2018 when we're giving these tax breaks to the ultra wealthy. The reality is that we need a New Deal. And I often call this a Green New Deal. And this is the idea that we can save our planet by converting to 100% renewable energy by 2035 and create high-wage jobs in rural Maine using our high potential for solar and literally humane technology. I happen to agree with Angus about rural electrification and high-speed broadband. I am an FDR Democrat, and I believe that we need to invest in our rural economies. Our rural Maine, the 2nd Congressional District, is in an economic depression longer and deeper than the Great Depression itself. We need to invest there. One way we can bring people there, by the way, is creating what I call a prosperity core. And a prosperity core is the idea that we invite young people to Maine, we make sure that we forgive their college debt, and at the same time, we partner with public and private, create jobs, invest in young people to create restaurants, breweries, new businesses. And when we invest, I was a CEO, I started my own company. I know what it takes to start a company. It takes investment. No one starts a successful business without investment. So we need to invest in the economy in order to make returns, in order to build these highway jobs. Last thing.
That's got to be the last word on this, unfortunately.
$15 minimum wage. Thank you.
$15 minimum. All right.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more of our News Center Voice of the Voter Forum with the candidates for Senate after this.
Next, The Voice welcomes multi-Grammy winner Mariah Carey. And she's preparing the artist.
It has to be a little bit more punched up.
For the most epic knockouts yet.
I'm so happy!
The Voice coming up next on NBC. Tonight, celebrate the most magical musical of all time with a wicked Halloween party hosted by Kristen Chenoweth and Idina Menzel, featuring an incredible performance by Ariana Grande. A very wicked Halloween tonight on NBC.
Maine's lobster industry doesn't just feed the world. It starts a food chain that feeds our entire economy. But as the planet and our waters warm, putting jobs at risk, Sean Moody denied humans impact climate change when asked, saying,
It's mostly, it's not.
If Sean Moody is willing to deny climate change and the impact it's having on our economy, he has no business being governor. The top funder of Maine Conservation Voters Action Fund is League of Conservation Voters.
My husband Jared is a lot of things. A son from a small business family, a Marine who signed up after 9/11, who came home and worked 3 jobs, working nights and weekends just to pay the bills, and a leader in the Maine House who cut taxes for the middle class and expanded healthcare for 70,000 Mainers. But most important to me, Jared has always put people first, and he'll keep doing that in Congress.
I'm Jared Golden, and I approve this message.
Service means different things to different people. For Jared Golden, it meant joining the Marines after 9/11, 2 combat tours, and an experienced leader working across the aisle for local veterans and working families. Congressman Bruce Poliquin has a different understanding. Years spent in Washington serving the special interests, increasing healthcare costs, increasing taxes on middle-class families, and taking nearly $400,000 from insurance interests. That's Bruce Poliquin's record of service, and it's not working for Maine. Vote Vets Action Fund is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
We're nearing the end of our Voice of the Voter Forum with the candidates for U.S. Senate. Before we get to the closing statements, a quick question, and it's something that's on a lot of people's minds, and it matters in your race. It's ranked choice voting. Are you going to use it? And are you,
Yes,
you're down with this?
100%. And I am going to rank me first and Angus second. And I'm going to do this because I believe that we can vote our hopes in this election.
Senator King?
I think ranked choice voting, I don't like the name. What it really is an instant runoff. And I think I probably will use it. I haven't decided how I'm going to mark that ballot yet.
And Senator Brakey?
Well, for me personally, when the 2 other choices are an open socialist and a soft-spoken socialist, I can't really pick either for my second choice. Maybe if I have to write someone in, maybe it'll be Paula Page.
All right, each candidate has 1 minute for a closing statement. We begin with the Democrat, Zak Ringelstein.
Sure. So my name is Zak Ringelstein. I am the Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate. I'm a teacher, I'm a dad, and I believe that we can do so much better. If you like the last 25 years and you feel like the last 25 years in Maine, in the U.S., your life has gotten better, then you should vote for Angus King. But truly, it hasn't gotten better. And I'm the only person in this race who's not taking corporate PAC lobbyist or fossil fuel money, because my children can't wait, my students can't wait. We need better in this country. We need to push a vision that is not corporate, that is American, that is human, and the people of Maine deserve better. I'm asking for you to rank me 1, Angus 2nd, and I'm asking for you to do that because we can vote our hopes. There is no spoiler effect. We can actually move towards the future. We can't wait till 2025 for this. We need to do it now, and I humbly ask for your vote because I will serve you. I will work hard to make sure that I represent your interests and that I go and I represent you boldly in the U.S. Senate.
Mr. Ringelstein, thank you very much. Next, Angus King.
As I've traveled Maine over the past 6 years, and particularly in the past year, I hear hope and heartbreak. The opioid crisis, which we haven't really gotten to today, is the most serious public health crisis I've seen in Maine in my lifetime. We need to keep working at it. We need to keep working about treatment availability. We need to keep working on law enforcement. We need to keep working on all of the provisions that will make people able to escape this curse. I also spend a lot of time with veterans who really, in many cases, aren't getting their needs met. And I think that's one of the things that we have to work on, seniors' access to health care. But there's also hope. There's some new initiatives in the forest economy, new investments in our paper mills. And I think what we need to do is face up and deal with those tough issues, but at the same time, build on the positives that are happening. There's a lot to do, and that's why I've decided it's not a time I feel I can walk away. I want to continue to serve the state of Maine.
Angus King, thanks very much. Finally, Eric Brakey, the Republican.
I'm running to represent you in the United States Senate because I think that we've gotten a rotten deal for far too long. And I think it's that as Maine people, we deserve a better deal. You know, Angus, as you got your first $8 million from Central Maine Power, from a big contract there while you were dating the top lobbyist for Central Maine Power. As governor, you changed the laws for the state, forcing us to subsidize companies that blow off the tops of our mountains, and then you went to work for them. Now you lobbied for millions of dollars from the Obama stimulus package for the companies you work for. You know, and you're now ranked the richest politician in Maine. You've worth an estimated $22 million. You know, on the left, they often tell us that the problem is big corporations in our country. On the right, they often say it's big government, but the truth is it's both. It's those politicians who sit in that revolving door of corporate and government power, enriching themselves on the rest of us. I'm representing a better deal for Maine, better jobs so our kids can stay here, better health care so we can access our doctors, more freedom so we can make our own choices and get Washington, D.C. out of our lives. If you're ready for a better deal for Maine, then I ask for your vote on November 6th.
Eric Brakey, thank you. Our thanks to all the candidates. That concludes our Voice of the Voter forums. Now it's your turn. Election Day 1 week from tomorrow. Stay with News Center for Voice of the Voter coverage leading up to the big day.